The will of Queen Charlotte. The fate of Queen Charlotte's estate remains somewhat ambiguous due to the uncertainty surrounding whether she ever drafted a will during her lifetime. It is possible she never considered it necessary, assuming that she may not outlive her husband, thereby leaving most of her possessions to him. During the long 18th century, many women did not outlive their husbands, largely due to the perils of childbirth. Remarkably, despite spending almost 12 years of her life pregnant, Queen Charlotte defied these odds and lived to the age of 74. Even as her husband descended into madness, she clung to the hope of his recovery, which might explain her delay in drafting a will. However, by autumn 1818, her eldest son alerted her to the severity of her health decline, with the doctors giving little hope for recovery. In early May 1818, after a particularly severe seizure, her private secretary, Lieutenant General Sir Herbert Taylor, strongly advised her to create a will. Though she initially refused, General Taylor began cataloguing her possessions in preparation. Throughout the summer, he presented several drafts to the Queen, but she remained resistant. By early November, as her condition worsened, the Prince Regent was informed by her physicians of the urgency of her situation. He then visited Kew Palace and advised his mother to settle her affairs while she still had the strength. Acknowledging the grim prognosis, Queen Charlotte, not one to be overly sentimental, finally conceded the necessity of making a will. She summoned General Taylor, who brought the most recent draft, and despite her frailty, they worked together to ensure all bequests met her approval. The Queen, still hopeful for her husband's recovery, insisted on a clause returning all of her jewels to King George III should he regain his faculties and outlive her. On Monday, November 16, 1818, General Taylor finalized and prepared a clean copy of the will. Queen Charlotte, with considerable effort, signed it that same day. The will was witnessed by her doctors Sir Francis Milman and Sir Henry Halford, along with a messenger sent by the Prince Regent to inquire about her health. General Taylor, undoubtedly relieved to have the will properly completed and witnessed, saw its timing as crucial. Queen Charlotte passed away the following afternoon, just a day after signing her will. On Tuesday, December 1st, 1818, Queen Charlotte's will was validated at Doctors' Commons just a day before her funeral. In Britain, the validation process known as proving a will required confirmation of the document's authenticity by a church court within 4 months of the deceased's death. This typically involved the executors and at least one witness appearing before a court official to affirm the will's legitimacy, after which the executors were granted the legal authority to manage the deceased estate. Queen Charlotte's executors were General Taylor and Baron Arden, the elder brother of the late Prime Minister Spencer. The Queen's personal property, excluding Crown possessions, was valued at just under £140,000. She had instructed that her debts, as well as the legacies and annuities for her servants and courtiers specified in her will, be paid from her own funds. If her funds were insufficient, the necessary amount was to be raised through the sale of her personal property. Queen Charlotte was aware that her sons and married daughters were financially provided for, so she left the majority of her estate to her 4 youngest daughters, Princesses Augusta, Elizabeth, Mary, and Sophia. These inheritances were designated for their sole benefit and were to remain their independent property, even in the event of marriage. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Mary eventually married during the Regency period, while Princess Augusta and Princess Sophia remained single. The Frogmore estate, located within Windsor Home Park, was bequeathed to Princess Augusta, with a stipulation that if the upkeep became too costly, the property would revert to the Crown in exchange for its cash value. Princess Augusta also inherited all the livestock, furnishings and fixtures at Frogmore House. She was delighted with Frogmore and resided there for the remainder of her life, often hosting her sisters for extended visits. After death, the property did revert to the Crown and became part of the Windsor estate. Queen Charlotte's other property at Windsor, the Lower Lodge estate, was left to her youngest daughter, Princess Sophia. However, since Princess Sophia preferred living in London, she seldom spent time at the country house that she inherited from her mother. Queen Charlotte's most prized possessions were not her estates at Windsor, but her extensive collection of jewels. In her will, she meticulously divided them into three distinct categories: those purchased by King George III at their marriage for £50,000, the exquisite Indian diamonds, and various other jewels that she had acquired over the years. She included a provision that if King George III regained his mental faculties, the jewels he had given her would be returned to him. Otherwise, they were to pass to his German relatives, the House of Hanover. The Arcot diamonds mentioned in the second category had a fascinating history. These flawless, pure white diamonds were likely mined in southern India in the 17th century. The collection featured 5 large brilliants, either oval or pear-shaped, weighing between 23 and 38 carats. They were named after their donor, Muhammad Ali Khan, who gifted them to Queen Charlotte in 1777 as gratitude for King George III and the British East India Company's support of his rule. One of the Arcot diamonds reached Queen Charlotte through an unusual series of events. During a reception in India, the gifter wore a ring set with one of the large diamonds. When Thomas Rumbold, the British governor of the province, admired the ring and asked for a closer look, he handed it over. Rumbold then placed the ring on his finger and thanked him for the gift. Despite his protests, Rumbold kept the ring, leveraging the need for British support. However, Colonel Sir Alexander Crosby, stationed in Madras and disapproving of his actions, devised a plan to reclaim the diamond. He persuaded them to write a letter to Queen Charlotte, offering her the ring as a symbol of gratitude. The letter arrived in Britain ahead of Rumbold, who, upon visiting the King and Queen, was compelled to present the ring to Charlotte. The third category in Queen Charlotte's will compromised jewels that she had received as gifts or purchased herself. She directed that all jewels in the second and third categories be sold, with the proceeds divided equally among her 4 daughters. However, it appears the Prince Regent had other plans, disregarding his mother's wishes and the well-being of his sisters. The executors of Queen Charlotte's will, burdened with numerous official duties, were slow to address the provisions of her estate. Their primary focus was settling her debts and ensuring the annuities she had specified, which took several months to complete. During this period, the Queen's jewels, particularly the diamonds, were largely overlooked. However, the Prince Regent, known for his desire for valuable jewels, kept them in mind. Though it is uncertain if he deliberately delayed the will's administration, it is clear that he intended to claim his mother's jewels as his own. This opportunity arose in January 1820, after the death of King George III. Upon his father's passing, the new King George IV declared all of George III's property, including Queen Charlotte's jewels, as his private possessions, not assets of the Crown. He disregarded his mother's bequest of the jewels to the House of Hanover, asserting that as the King of Hanover, they rightfully belonged to him. George IV had the larger Arcot diamonds removed from their settings to adorn a new crown that he commissioned for himself. He retained most of the Queen's other jewels, but rarely wore them. Consequently, despite Queen Charlotte's wishes, her 4 daughters never received any proceeds from the sale of her jewels. George IV appropriated them as his personal property, ignoring his sisters' requests to honour their mother's will. Meanwhile, Queen Charlotte's other personal belongings were auctioned off at Christie's from May to August 1819. This extensive sale included her clothing, snuff collection, personal items, household linens, china, silver, furniture, books, prints, and drawings. Among the auctioned items was a fringe-making machine from 1790s, which Queen Charlotte had owned and used. This machine has survived and was sold by Bonhams in the 21st century. It remains unclear if the proceeds from these sales were distributed to the four royal princesses, as directed by their mother's will. Hopefully, they did receive these funds, since her brother had denied them the income from the jewels. George IV retained his mother's jewels until his death in June 1830. After his passing, the largest Arcot diamonds were removed from his crown and set into a new crown for Queen Adelaide, wife of King William IV. Following King William's death in 1837, the Arcot diamonds were eventually sold at auction, but the proceeds did not seem to benefit the surviving royal princesses. The diamonds were purchased by Robert Grosvenor, the first Marquis of Westminster, and stayed with the Grosvenor family until June 1959. At that time, the third Duke of Westminster sold them to pay death duties after his father's passing. The American jeweller Harry Winston bought the Arcot diamonds, recutting the two largest stones to enhance their clarity and brilliance. These were set into rings sold to private clients in Texas. The diamonds resurfaced in 1993 when Van Cleef & Arpels purchased them. The largest stone, the pear-shaped Arcot, was set as a pendant in a necklace and sold to a Saudi jeweller. The current whereabouts of the other Arcot diamonds, once owned by Queen Charlotte, are unknown. After George IV's death, his brother William IV held Queen Charlotte's wedding diamonds, given to her by King George III, and bequeathed to the House of Hanover. However, upon William IV's passing, the Hanoverian throne passed to their younger brother, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. Queen Victoria, who had ascended to the British throne, could not inherit the Hanoverian throne due to Salic law, which prohibited female succession in Hanover. Queen Victoria had grown quite attached to a necklace and some other jewels from Queen Charlotte's collection and wore them frequently. When her uncle, the new King of Hanover, demanded these jewels as his rightful inheritance, she refused. Ernest Augustus then initiated a legal battle to reclaim the jewels, and after a protracted legal struggle lasting 20 years, a court ruled in favour of Hanover in 1857, and Queen Charlotte's wedding jewels were sent to Hanover. Before parting with the diamonds, Queen Victoria had the court jeweller replicate her favourite pieces. She bequeathed these copies to the Crown, and they are now part of the British Crown jewels. Interestingly, a piece of Queen Charlotte's wedding jewels rejoined the British Royal Collection in 1909. This piece is a ring featuring a miniature profile of King George III, painted by Jeremiah Mayer for use on British coinage. The portrait is encased in a flat-cut diamond and surrounded by small rose diamonds. It is believed that Queen Charlotte wore this ring on her right hand's little finger during her wedding. You can view this ring on the Royal Collection website. The grasping behaviour of the Prince of Wales concerning his mother's jewels could serve as an intriguing plot point in a romance novel. Though not widely known to the general public, many at court and in government circles were aware of his actions. His sisters, being female and unmarried, were his victims, and he took advantage of his position as their guardian after their mother's death. Although George IV's actions occurred shortly after the Regency period, they still fall within the broader historical context and could add depth and intrigue to your Regency romance narrative. The Will of King George III. King George III reigned from 1760 until his death in 1820, and he was the longest reigning monarch of Britain at the time. His reign, which spanned over 60 years, saw numerous transformations in British society and politics. However, George III's later years were marred by a series of mental health crises, which became increasingly severe beginning around 1801 and culminating in the early 1810s. His mental illness severely impacted his ability to govern, and by 1811 his son, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, was appointed as regent under the Regency Act. The political instability created by George III's mental illness significantly shaped his final years, and the creation of his will was an important step in outlining the governance of Britain during his incapacitation. The will, signed on the 21st of November 1810, has become a historical document of profound importance in understanding the later years of the Georgian monarchy, especially as it relates to the functioning of the royal family and the British government during the Regency. The key provisions of George III's will. Regency arrangements. The central purpose of George III's will was to ensure that the governance of Britain continued despite the king's failing mental health. The document made clear that if George III was incapacitated or unfit to rule, that his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, would take over the royal duties as regent. This was not a new arrangement, but rather a formalisation of the existing situation, given that the king's mental faculties were increasingly compromised by 1810. The will confirmed George IV, then the Prince of Wales, as the regent, granting him authority to act on behalf of the king in matters of state. This was crucial as it solidified the prince's role in the Regency, which was already being anticipated by Parliament and the public. The Regency would officially begin in 1811, following the Prince of Wales' assumption of the role after George III's mental health deteriorated to the point where he could no longer effectively fulfil his royal duties. The Regency lasted until George III's death in 1820, during which time the Prince Regent exercised full sovereign authority, although often clashing with political figures and his own family. George III's will maintained the established line of succession to the throne. It confirmed that upon his death, the crown would pass to the eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who would become George IV. As George III's children were his closest heirs, the will solidified the royal succession, which had been an ongoing concern due to the health of the king and the future of the monarchy. The king's will marked the formal recognition of George IV as the next monarch, and the document was seen as both a legal and political confirmation of his position as the rightful heir. His succession was significant not only because it secured the monarchy for the next generation, but also because it highlighted the deep tensions between father and son. Despite being a prominent figure in British society, George IV had a difficult relationship with his father, marked by personal animosity and ideological differences. The will did not directly address these tensions, but it effectively placed the Prince of Wales in the position of power. Another crucial aspect of the will was the management of the king's estates, wealth, and royal finances. George III had extensive properties and income sources, including royal palaces, lands, and investments. The will outlined how these assets would be distributed among his surviving children, though it gave special financial positions to the Prince Regent. The king's finances were carefully managed during the Regency, as George III had concerns over his son's extravagant spending habits. However, the will provided George IV with a substantial income, which he then used to maintain his lavish lifestyle. George IV was granted funds sufficient to uphold his position as regent, though this did not stop the prince from engaging in often costly adventures, including numerous building projects and his extravagant court. The will also made provisions for George III's other surviving children, including the Duke of York, the Duke of Cumberland, and the other royal siblings. These provisions ensured that George III's children had the financial support necessary to live in accordance with their royal status,
though it was George IV who became the central financial beneficiary of the royal estate. The financial provisions of the will reflected the complicated relationship between George III's immediate family and the royal finances. The Prince Regent's often excessive spending strained the royal budget, which only heightened tensions within the family, particularly with George IV's siblings and political figures who disagreed with his lavish spending. While George III's mental illness was never explicitly stated in his will, the document made provision for how governance should proceed during periods of his incapacity. The king's mental state had been deteriorating for several years before the will was drafted, and by 1810 it had become apparent that he would be unable to fulfil his royal duties to an extended period. The will does not directly mention his illness, which was a matter of both personal and political sensitivity. The exact cause of the king's illness was not fully understood at the time, and there was very little public acknowledgement of its true nature. His illness remained largely a private matter within the royal family, though it was increasingly becoming a public concern. Despite the lack of acknowledgement in the will, the Regency arrangements effectively sidelined George III from public life, and George IV assumed power as regent. The will, therefore, served as a legal tool to manage the monarchy during George III's incapacity, without directly confronting the issue of his mental health. The king's will provides insight into his complex relationships with his family, especially his son, the Prince of Wales. George III and George IV had a tumultuous relationship, marked by political disagreements and personal animosity. The Prince Regent, in particular, was often seen as a dissenter and rival to his father, though the Regency Act and the will made it clear that George IV would eventually take the throne. Despite the Prince of Wales being confirmed as regent, George III was known to disapprove of his son's extravagant lifestyle, political ambitions, and his personal behaviour. The financial provisions in the will indicated that George III recognised his son's need for substantial funds, but also imposed limits on how these funds could be used. The will did not address the emotional distance between George III and his other children. While George III's surviving children were provided for, his strained relationship with his eldest son overshadowed much of his later life. Upon George III's death in 1820, his son George IV ascended the throne, but his reign was marked by ongoing political tensions and royal dissatisfaction. The Regency period itself had been fraught with personal and political conflict, and the legacy of George III's will played a significant role in shaping the future of the monarchy. The financial implications of the will continued to affect the royal family for years to come. George IV's lavish spending habits and the political ramifications of his role as regent created tensions within the family, but the monarchy itself remained stable.